Hello, everyone.
Good. Hey, Rob.
Hey, Tanisha, how are you?
I'm well. How are you?
Doing well, thanks.
And Stan, I see Stan dropped in too.
I did.
Nice.
Hi, Tanisha.
How are you doing?
All right. Happy Friday.
Yes.
Exactly.
All right. I have made you guys co-hosts, so you can, if anyone
Okay.
interrupts you, or if you need to unmute them or whatever the case may be, you can do so. So squad, I would like to introduce you to our guests today. Rob and Stan, they're both from MicroFocus. Rob is going to be talking to us today about risk management and how it applies to your future cybersecurity career. So I'm going to go ahead and let them get started.
Great. Thanks, Tanisha. Let me go ahead and share out some slides, and then we'll go from there. Tanisha, it's giving me a message on the sharing. So let me try again.
Sorry, how about now?
Let me try it. It looks like it's letting me now. Pull that up. All right. Can you see the slides? Let me go to present mode.
Yes, sir.
Get this out of the way. Okay, great. Well, thanks for the intro. So again, folks, my name is Rob Borrego, Chief Security Strategist with CyberRes, which is a part of MicroFocus. I think if any of you had an opportunity to join last week's Lunch and Learn, you talked with a couple of my colleagues, Eric Popiel and John Fange. I know they were talking about ransomware. This one here, we're going to talk about it. As Tanisha was mentioning, we had a conversation kind of setting the stage for it, and thought it was really valuable to take a different approach and getting you thinking a little differently about cybersecurity, and more so as it relates to the organizations that you may be a part of today, are hoping to be a part of in the future, and what it really means to them on the business side of things, and the role cyber should be playing, and the opportunities we should be considering, and conversations we should be having from a cyber perspective. What I will say is, I hope the key takeaway for all of you from the conversation that we'll walk through here is to understand that you all have a great opportunity to really differentiate yourselves in the different organizations that you, again, may be a part of today or hoping to be a part of in the future, in thinking this way, in thinking as it relates to what are we as the organization we're part of trying to actually accomplish as our key goals, and what role cyber plays in it, and thinking in the outcomes-based approach. So it's not going to be us obviously getting into the technology aspects of it. I think you guys go through plenty of those different types of sessions. We want to take a different type of approach today in helping share that. And I really want it to be very open and engaging with you. You have myself and you have Stan Wisman here as well that can really kind of give you some good feedback and some different thoughts on how to approach this. And again, just think about it a little bit differently. So let's kind of jump in. And I think, one of the things that you'll think of here, as I'm not advancing, there we go. Okay. One of the things that you'll think about initially, let me go back and clear this up. Okay, is the role of the Chief Information Security Officer, which I'm sure you kind of had some visibility into and some thoughts, and just think about it from what's the cyber perspective, kind of on the things that they're thinking about. And so, the CISO, when you look across kind of these different areas, they're looking at the particular needs for their organizations and what are they going to do kind of around identity access management. How are they going to tie into securing their different network environments, right? What are the different applications they have? And the list goes on and on and on. Historically, a lot of what's happened in this regard has been very much a kind of technically minded approach to how we actually will solve for these different areas. And a CISO kind of comes typically from that. Let me just see if I can mute. I think we're okay now. From that kind of technical background, which is fine, right? I came from a technical background. Stan's come from a technical background, right? And we've over time really pivoted into that translation layer into the business side of the equation, which we'll get into. What we're seeing out there is also that the CISO role, right, is advancing into that need of, again, what's the business actually asking of cyber specifically? And it's different based on the vertical that they may be part of, but even within the vertical, right? So it could be financial services, insurance, manufacturing. It's just understanding the aspects of what that particular business is trying to deal with and what the actual role is that they'll play. So what it gets us into a bit of is thinking of it from a risk perspective. And I pulled this stat up. I always like to look at this as a piece of information that comes out at the beginning of each year from the World Economic Forum. It's important to understand the why behind it. The reason I find it valuable is because a lot of conversations that I'm having, that Stan's having with different organizations, right, is around the C level and what it is that their organizations are trying to accomplish. And then what does that translate into for us from a cybersecurity perspective? When you look at the audience that reads the actual output of this report, it's the CEO, the CFO, Chief Risk Officer. And so, it's a key set of individuals with a lot of power in their organizations and very much concerned as to what are the particular things they should be considering from overarching risk, kind of basically anything enterprise risk oriented. And so what you see here that came out earlier this year is, kind of the typical things that they're looking at in risk around, natural weather issues, right? Climate change, but the purple elements are anything that are technology specific risks, right? And cybersecurity failures is absolutely at the top of the list, as you can see here. And so this is not necessarily anything new, right? This isn't the first time that cyber's been put into this top 10 list. Matter of fact, cyber's been part of 5, but this is different because it's in the focal point of likelihood, right? So there's different kind of elements that they're actually reporting out. This is on likelihood. So basically meaning that people are realizing that cybersecurity and issues relative to cybersecurity are extremely likely to occur and impact their particular business. So it's really elevated itself to the top. Now, the other thing I think is really important to understand is this kind of evolution of the influence, value, and understanding of what cybersecurity really means to the businesses. And this particular survey came out actually a few years back, but it's still so relevant. And actually, I think it's evolved very nicely, which is two sets of kind of the audience that the question was asked to. The question is very simply is, why is information security important to your business? The audience that responded were the CISO, but also the different business executives, okay? And so again, in orange, you see the response from the business executives, and the blue is the CISO response. Now, you can see down at the very bottom, right? I think if the question was asked probably 2 years prior to this actual survey time, it would have been a guardian of corporate assets would have been much more far over to the right. And that's the kind of way they thought of it, right? The second is kind of like, how do we just ensure that we're protecting our different environment from a cybersecurity perspective? Now, as you can see though, the response, which is extremely positive, is cybersecurity for the business leaders is actually being thought of completely differently. Thought about as, wait a minute, what actually can it do, cybersecurity do, to make our organization, our products and services back out to our different customers, whether it's business to consumer, business to business, a differentiator, right? How do we compete in the market? And how does cybersecurity play a key role in that? That's huge. That's a huge win for where we're looking at taking all of us, right, in our field in cybersecurity to the next level. So not just continuously kind of being thought about the technology only aspect, but no, now being a key influence in how we actually shape the business and take it forward. And you've also seen over the past, year and a half, tons and tons of new roles being posted out there to fill the job of product security specific individuals. So organizations like medical device manufacturers, as an example, right? They've had their corporate security teams in place to obviously do the things we're used to, right? How are we securing our network environments, our applications? How are we protecting the data? How are we monitoring the environment for incidents, and so on and so forth? But then there's this other side, which is what products we bring to market, for example, again, in the medical devices industry, and how do we ensure that they're secured, right? Because they're connected devices. So are we ensuring that we're actually looking at, as we're developing the concept for a new product, what elements of it need to be taken into account from a cybersecurity perspective, from a trust, from a brand experience, all of those elements we'll get into in a bit. So again, thinking of it differently, keeping it kind of in a very simple way to start really bringing this all together. What I'm outlining for you here is we look at how quickly organizations are moving, right? The opportunities in digital are expansive. The opportunities for new businesses to be launched have been so much simplified because of all the different technology elements that can be delivered as a SaaS or cloud-based type of model. And then you have the organizations that have been around for some time that are looking to pivot, right, and change and embrace all these new capabilities to make them much more competitive, to reduce costs, and all of the other things that come along for the ride. So elements, as you can see here, around, how are they able to take the insights for the different types of data sets that they have to translate that into opportunities that they have to, again, to bring new solutions to market, to differentiate themselves versus the competition. So now there's this kind of concept of, well, we have to ensure we're protecting, right, the different types of data elements that are out there. It could be around the increasing the speed that we get to market, the actual markets that we're creating out there as new opportunities for our business, launching a new line of business. And then also things around just, how do we engage with our different consumers and the actual trust and privacy elements that are required by those consumers of us as an organization going forward. So there's all these different kind of facets built in as part of this speed in moving back out into taking advantage of transforming businesses to be more digitally oriented or coming to market as a digital business out of the gates. When you think about kind of the top level viewpoints, again, at that kind of, the executive level, the board of directors, these are really key facets of what they're concerned about, what they're taking into consideration. So it's understanding from a cybersecurity perspective, where are we aligning to deliver the value back into the organization we're part of? Understanding that a lot of what they think about at the highest levels is how do we ensure that our business continues to operate to generate the revenues that we expect and need and require of it, right? How do we ensure that the brand loyalty continues and that we continue to have the trust of our different client base out there? how do we ensure that when something occurs, we're minimizing the actual cost associated to that to our business? So for example, if an organization is breached, right, there's so many different ramifications behind that. There's the cost associated to dealing with the breach. There's the cost behind the scenes associated with potentially losing customers, losing market share, right? So there's all these different elements that come into play. What's the confidence going forward of our investors because of what's occurred? So there's all of these different things, again, that the executive levels are really concerned about. And from a cyber perspective, we need to translate that back into how we think about what we're doing with the different initiatives in front of us. And I'll share with you an example that I think kind of lays it out pretty straightforward. Is when a CISO, for example, is meeting with the board of directors, they have a very finite time to explain basically what the cybersecurity posture is for the organization. But ultimately, that little window of time, on average maybe 10 minutes, is to actually go through and ultimately have an ask, right? An ask typically for more funding that the board would approve to ultimately mature their security program. But when they're talking, right, I've seen examples that have not gone very well where one organization is a payments company and the individual in his first presentation to the board was talking about the need that they had to better secure their environments because of the different types of threats that they're seeing out there. They're all aware of what they've seen out in the news. So you understand that that's a risk to our organization as well. And so the way I see us going forward to support helping us prevent those things from happening to our specific organization is for us to upgrade some of the different technology we have and to go and invest in some next generation firewall technologies. And therefore, we're going to need about X amount of dollars to do so. If you're thinking again, from a person who's business minded, doesn't understand technology, honestly, they really don't care about it, right? They care about the outcomes. That just went completely over their head. And very likely that person didn't get the funding, and they actually didn't. So it was kind of a learning experience. Now, on the flip side, great example of that conversation in a very positive manner. Brett Arsenal is the CISO, still is the CISO at Microsoft. And I've heard him share this story several times, which is how he's approached the conversation, again, that finite time he has in talking to the business executives, again, to ultimately get what he wants. And basically does two things, right? One is the preparation, which is he gets alignment with the different stakeholders, a couple folks that are on the board that he can have a relationship with and explain to them ahead of the actual board meeting what it is that he's going to share, get some feedback, get some buy-in from them prior to the actual board meeting in regards to what ultimately he's asking from them. And so the preparation is absolutely critical. The second element is now getting in there and sharing basically what's seen as of most recent relative news in the cyber world that may be impacting Microsoft as an example. So if you take as an example the different ransomware attacks that we've seen out there, right? Brett would have come and based an approach that says, so you've all seen obviously what's been happening out there consistently, right? Colonial Pipeline, JBS, all these different ransomware attacks everywhere. So obviously your ask is, what about us? What's it mean to us? Are we at risk? The answer is, yeah, we're at risk, but we've assessed as best we can the different areas that were specifically associated to what we know about those different types of attacks. Back into our organization, we have identified some areas of concern, some gaps that we need to fill. We are filling those gaps and making good progress to be able to ensure that we feel good coverage for those areas. It's not to mean it's not going to happen, but learning and applying what we've learned to better our organization, we're in motion, we're doing those things. So what's he done? He's alleviated the concern that the people have kind of come to the meeting thinking about all this news that they've seen. Done, check the box, off the table. Now it gets to his ask, which is, now what we're trying to accomplish is X, Y, and Z, and to be able to support the business to achieve those goals, which you're all very aware of. Here's what we're looking at doing to support that from a cyber perspective, and here's the things that we're looking to accomplish and what we need. He gets to the point of taking the concern off the table, getting to the point of aligning to the business requirements that the board is already on board with, and then saying basically, here's what I need from you in order to support your desired goals in the business, right? So again, we're looking at it completely differently.
Hey, Rob.
Ultimately, go ahead, Stan.
Yeah, Tanisha made an interesting point that the conversation with the executives or the board can go easier after post-breach, after a breach. I mean, that could be true, Tanisha. Unfortunately, sometimes if you're the leader, you could be collateral damage. Not saying that they're going to shoot the messenger, but that certainly has happened in the past. Rob, what's your thoughts on this?
No, you're right. You're right. I think it's happened in the past for sure. I think we're starting to see a little bit more of understanding, if you will, and flexibility. But yeah, post-breach is the basic eye opener many times.
And if you set expectations properly, right? Again, you're not, as you just said in the ransomware, to best of our knowledge, we are doing what we can to mitigate this threat this way, and we have identified issues. We're trying to control those. But without a doubt, if there is a heightened awareness because there has been some kind of breach experience, it sometimes loosens the funds. But that could be just a moment in time thing. You need to have an approach and strategy that's not dependent on a breach.
But
Absolutely. I think, go ahead, Stacia.
I was just gonna say, I think that just amplifies your point of being able to tie it to the business outcomes, because if you can do that, then they'll understand the need to it so that it's not a reactive approach. You can kind of be proactive, but if you are, as a whole, not good at, tying it to the business outcome and making them understand why this is important before a breach, then, you have these situations where you've got to pay the ransoms, and, there's usually someone who's going to fall, on the sword because of situations like this, especially high profile ones.
Yes. Well, there's also the other aspect of some organizations, even from a compliance perspective, right? Assessing what the actual potential cost penalty of the fine would be from whatever regulatory body it may be, and saying, am I willing to invest more funds into my cyber needs to fulfill that particular compliance mandate, or is it actually cheaper for me to pay the fine, right? And I think we've had too many of those it's cheaper to pay the fine incidents in the past, where now it's starting to come to fruition that the reality is no. Again, as long as we're understanding why we're doing what we're doing, to spend in cyber to align with what we need to accomplish. Compliance is one of the things on the side, that's fine, but everything that comes along for the ride is critically important to how we're trying to drive our business forward. If it's understood in that manner, and which I think is definitely maturing into that direction, it's making that change. So we're seeing a lot of positive movement, again, in how the conversations are being had to be better understood than just thinking about the cost factor around a penalty for not being compliant versus the cost of investing in something for bettering our cyber program, right? So
to be clear,
there's a lot of good maturity kind of elements come into play.
The fine that you're talking about is not the actual cost of, like, if you were breached and, if we're talking about ransomware, that you have to get back your systems back up. You're talking about the regulatory fines for not meeting whatever compliance. Correct. It's cheaper to just pay that fine than it is to actually implement what's needed to, avoid the fine, basically.
That's exactly right. If you took PCI as an example, payment card industries, data security standard, and they look at that and they say, the penalties on average are going to be about 1.2 million for our particular tier. I'm willing to pay that fine if it ever comes to fruition for us to have to do so, versus paying $2 million for the additional technology investment, right? That's the example. So kind of key elements of just thinking about business outcomes. And I like to look at this as, so if in your shoes, your involvement within, again, an organization may be part of today or in the future, something has come over to your awareness of a project that organization is planning for, hopefully not already in motion, but planning for. You have a stake within that particular project from the cyber perspective. you're going to look at it maybe so from a technology, how do I solve for the problem? How do I enable the solution, whatever it may be for that project? That's a given. But you should also be thinking about where are there opportunities where any of these particular outcomes could be inserted in some different ways that I can apply in thinking and supporting that project, right? So these are things that are constant across any organization, right? So again, I mentioned earlier, each organization will have their particular goals for whatever they're working on that you want to align to. But beyond that, just thinking holistically, these 5 areas of key outcomes, it doesn't matter what business you're in, you're looking for these different types of opportunities. So my point is, as you're looking at different types of projects that you're getting pulled into, think about also where you can support the conversation and help your role right within the organization to be more aligned to the business, to say, well, I was thinking about this, and from a cyber perspective, as much as we're solving here and there in these ways, we may also have an opportunity to actually reduce the cost by doing X, right? We're definitely planning on, ensuring that we're reducing our risk because we have identified these particular areas that might be of concern. If there's great opportunity there to be able to insert more into the opportunity for driving the revenue up, that's great. But also the other aspects about, security is now being very much intertwined into privacy, into trust, right? Trust back up to our, again, business partners, our consumers, whatever different type of organization you may be a part of. And that intertwines back into the experience, right? So a lot of the key themes we're hearing about is how do we ensure we make the user experience as great as possible and just behind the scenes embed security in. So these are kind of all the different things that you can start looking at in different projects you may be getting into and getting involved in. Just again, think about these things in the back of your mind and see if there's an opportunity for you to insert. And if you can insert that into the conversation, you're elevating yourself and your stature within the organization to be thought about much more. All right, they're connecting the dots from what technology enables for the business, right? So it's a major, I think, area of opportunity to mature your careers over time. What I'm going to do is pivot to something I put together. This is, I don't know, maybe 2-3 years ago, but I think it just, when I look at it, I just try to figure out how can I take something that's so complex, such as cyber risk, and try to simplify it as best as possible. Cyber risk gets into, looking at different types of qualitative, quantitative type of analysis and tries to put measurements in place and whatnot. And for cyber, it's really difficult to do. Cyber insurance is obviously pretty prominent out there, and there's all sorts of actuarial science behind the scenes to figure out, what type of insurance kind of policies and coverage that should be put applied. And they're trying to map that back into the different policies for cyber now. That's fine. I'm keeping this very, very simple, but simple in a way where it's also easy to have the conversation, again, with whoever you may be engaging with, wherever you are today, where you may be going in your career. And when I look at it as those 4 kind of simple elements to think about is any organization, right? You need to have a good grasp and understanding of what the data is within your organization, right? If you can know about all the data, that's the utopia, not likely, but more so about what's the most relevant and important data to our particular organization, or in a large enterprise, right, the different lines of business. So that's getting kind of into different conversations to understand with the different stakeholders, what is it that's most important to you? So for example, if you're in a line of business that is delivering product, you want to know that your IP, right, is protected. Is there a question? So again, as I was saying, you want to know that for, again, product line, you want to know that your intellectual property in developing that solution is truly protected, right? If you're in a line of business that is associated with handling consumer data, you want to make sure that their consumer data, that personally identifiable information, is protected. But you also need to know where it lives, right? So again, it's just getting a handle on what's most relevant on the data side. And we're going to get into each of these areas a little bit. So the first piece is the data. What data do I have that's most relevant to supporting my business or the particular line of business that I'm in, and ensuring that we know where it resides and that somehow, some way, we're properly protecting it. The second is on the application side. And again, we'll delve into these areas, but the applications are all about, the key areas of how ultimately people are getting to the data, but the applications are the interface in many cases on how our clients are working back and through in engaging with our organizations, right? And ultimately behind it is delivering some sort of value back to our business. It's delivering some revenue to our business. So how are we ensuring that those applications are best secured? Because we know that security vulnerabilities are coming in at the application level. The third piece of it is really thinking about it from the identities and think about it on how we understand who has access to what within the different parts of our network environments, the different applications, different data elements, and have as best a possible breakout and understanding of what that should look like, and ensure that we're going through the process of proper validation and acceptance of them coming back into the environments. And then that fourth element to round it out is, how can we best ensure that we're identifying the different security incidents that are occurring, right? So this kind of typically will fall into the security operations side of the house, but it's in the means of being able to understand, how can we ensure that we have the best visibility to what's occurring in our environment? How can we drive better automation where appropriate, right? That we can basically say the security analyst should not have to work on kind of this low-hanging, monotonous task of responding to these lower level types of incidents. Let's offload that and automate some of those capabilities so that we can elevate the analyst into higher value areas of focus for our particular organization. That could be looking at and doing further investigations, doing other things like threat hunting and otherwise. So keeping it simple, as I mentioned, so just kind of 4 elements thought about there. And then what I'd like to take into account next is saying, well, how do we have some of these different kind of conversations? So if you start breaking these things down, right, you'll see I'll map out like 3 questions for each of these. We don't need to go through all of them, but basically what it is think about always asking an open-ended question. So you always see I typically have a how type of question I'm posing. And think about it in the sense of just the person you're engaging with, or people, if it's a project again you're working on, posing these questions back so that they're just approaching and thinking about it differently, again, to connect it back into what we need on the business side of it. So from a data side of things, it could be something like that second question there, right? How are we securing the data that we're using for analytics, right? That's supporting these new or existing revenue streams for our business. What does that really mean behind the scenes? So it gets people thinking in this regard. So we kind of alluded to it earlier on these different big data kind of initiatives. You hear data analytics initiatives. Every one of these large organizations are looking at how they can better monetize data. Now, the problem or the risk factor that we're needing to deal with is they're basically just pumping all of this data from all the different systems into these different repositories, right? You hear data lakes, data ponds, which is fine, but what type of data is in there? Are we at risk with the type of information that's being put in there? Are there privacy regulations associated to what type of information is being accessible and who's seeing that information, right? So they don't always think about what the ramifications are from a risk to the organization in that cyber lens. It gets them thinking about that, right? But it also inserts the opportunity to include security in that level, right? So again, it's looking at things differently. It's awareness of the different projects that are going on, having the conversations with the different stakeholders, the different team members, and getting them to think about it from a cyber perspective. It allows you to truly be inserted into it, right? Because a lot of what we talk about is the awareness of the projects that are going on at the earliest stage is critical for the influence that we have the ability to insert security into. Because still many a time, we're being plugged in way too late, either in motion in the middle or just before something's ready to go into production. And at that point in time, again, it's way too late in the game, right? So just different ways to think about this. Another one at the bottom here is all these different organizations, we discussed this previously as well, is they're all going through this pivot and shift to the cloud, right? Either, again, if it's a new organization, they're starting in the cloud, but if it's a legacy organization, a lot of these banking organizations, they've been slow to adopt the cloud. They are doing so now. But they're also looking at the risks associated to how do they move these different applications into the cloud. And how are they ensuring the security of the type of information that's being presented up there, right? So the opportunities to be able to ensure that as these projects are going on around cloud migrations, the thoughts and understanding of the security ramifications are in there. And it's not we have to get away from the kind of the office of no, right? There's been this kind of tagline out there for a while now that cybersecurity is the office of no. So anything we want to do to advance different things in our business, technology-wise, we go talk to cybersecurity, we have a conversation, and they're like, no, you can't do that. You can't be moving data up to the cloud. It's no longer that, right? It's much more the thinking about how are we actually going to support the business that wants to move to the cloud, that wants to do this new, technology-driven initiative. How are we supporting them with cyber at the core of it? If you think about it from the application side, this is definitely another one that is very much.
Hey, Rob.
It's been. Yes, Tanisha, go ahead.
I'm sorry. So there's a question in the chat. It says, are all 4 elements broken down into different departments, or would identity and access role handle all 4 elements of security? I think this is in reference to your last slide.
So the elements can cross over many different functions. So, for example, yes, an identity access management kind of team would be at the core, but they would be supporting all different types of parts of the business. It could interchange back into how people are accessing the different applications as we're going into here, ultimately how they're getting to the data. So what I'm saying is they are all interacting with one another, those 4 elements. They do have individual areas in some cases to support them overall. So each element, for example, data security is one area of typically kind of functional team supporting that. Application security, another one, and so on and so forth. But there's also the interaction amongst them.
And Rob, a great example, I think, that sort of crosses that boundary is how API governance is being handled. You could view the access to the application programming interfaces of your applications as a identity access management function, or it could be viewed as an application security concern because that's an attack vector that's hitting the applications, right? And so it is an access question, but it's also obviously an application security concern too.
Yeah, very good example. Tanisha, I'm sorry, I'm not monitoring the chat. You see anything else coming through?
No, that was all.
Okay, just keep on jumping in like that. I appreciate it. So on the application side, again, you can see the questions here, but a lot of the aspect of it that we've been dealing with over time, if you look at number 2 is a great example. So it's where does the application security aspect plug into the development lifecycle? And you have to look at it from the developer side of it. So again, think about this, right? So in an insurance business, the organization is looking to maybe release a new mobile app or an updated mobile app, right, for insurance claims for their consumers, the clients. And so the requirements for this application, this mobile app, are presented. The development team now has it in their hands, and they have a deadline to meet. And that deadline being met is critical. Why? Because it associates itself to more adoption of customers, more revenue to the organization. It's always about, obviously, what the business is able to positively drive out of the technology that they're delivering to market. Developers now are running off to the races. They're going through and processing and testing everything out with the QA teams, and they're off and delivering it out. And was security thought about at any point in time? Maybe, depending on the organization, but we've had that kind of tough issue of the security team is thought of as basically coming in and just slowing down the development process, because again, developers are dealing with the deadline to meet. And so there's been this constant push, and you kind of hear about the shift left methodologies. How can we ensure that we're really pushing ourselves up into the forefront of awareness in the first place of these different projects we've been talking about, and get a seat at the table to ensure that we're part of the conversation to secure the application throughout the development process, and do so in a manner where, if you look at something as an example of DevOps, right? DevOps is moving so quickly in development and release of applications. Security getting in there is still thought about as really slowing them down. But again, the synergies of mapping in and ensuring that security is truly a part of it and baking it in is what's critically important. So there's a lot of work that's been going on in that particular area as an example of really being aware of, again, what the projects are that organizations working on, the why at the end of it, but streamlining that whole process of securing the development lifecycle as a whole. Stan, I know this is a sweet spot for you. Did you want to add anything on this particular area?
No, I think you covered it, unless somebody has any questions.
Okay. All right, then we'll I think actually before I move on, the last question is actually a key one that helps support what we just discussed. And it was the example I mentioned earlier of a project that basically goes out and is released into production with security as an afterthought. And there are studies out there that prove it is so much more costly to not include security and to have to dealing with the security ramifications and issues after the fact. So it's the cost of having to go back and redevelop the code or make the changes and adjustments appropriate, the testing and all of it that comes along the way. But what about the cost of those customers aren't happy that their data was breached through that new mobile application the insurance provider just put out there? That customer may actually decide they're going to move on to a different insurer, right? There's many options for them to move on to. And so now you have a problem with the actual brand, the consumer trust, and everything else that comes for it. So think about some of those things as we're going through these different examples. The breach defense side of it is more about that element on identification of the different security incidents that are occurring. And it comes from many different directions, right? A lot of it is really centered around organizations coming to kind of the realization that they're not going to necessarily be able to protect everything that's within their environments. They're going to do the best they can, obviously, to do so, but things are still going to happen. So the emphasis has been on how can we ensure that we are detecting those incidents as quickly as possible to reduce the impact to our organization. And so that's a lot of, again, getting an understanding first and foremost of what are those most critical assets to the organization. So where's the data that's most critical to the organization sit? What systems, what applications are supporting them? Who are the individuals that are accessing them? Rounding that out and having a very good holistic understanding of what those things ultimately are as the key assets, emphasize the protection on those areas, but also understand that when something's occurring that are impacting those key assets, the teams are focusing their time and energy more so on those versus lower priority type of impact to the organization, right? Another key area around that is, as you can see, that first kind of question alludes to is, what are you seeing out there as it concerns the different types of users you have within your environment? And that's typically tied back into like an insider threat type of concern. So do we have disgruntled employees, right? Do we have issues where they're taking data and they're siphoning it out as part of just being so irritated with the organization or being on their way out the door? Is there intellectual property that they're taking and they're basically selling it to the competition? And that definitely happens out there. So just different examples of what you can look at in regards to looking at it from the detection and response side of it. And then rounding it out is looking at it from the identity aspect, as we talked about with the fourth element. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier too, as one of the kind of key business outcomes, desired business outcomes. And it kind of plays into the second question. So a lot of what we're seeing is you have the, how do I deal with my own user population for my organization and ensuring kind of in that first bullet point that they have the right access to the right applications, the right systems at the right times, right? And the validation process when they're coming in to access those things, make sure that I'm managing that process, approving it. And I keep an eye on it too, to see if anything kind of is changing as they're in the environment and they're doing things that behaviorally is not the norm, then I can have some indicators that pop up and make me aware of that and I can decide to take action. But the other aspect is, what about the actual experience as it relates to not just my user population, but also my consumers that I'm supporting out there through my different web interfaces and so on. And so a lot of that ties back into, I need to look at security kind of, I hate to say it, but as 1B, where 1A really is the overarching user experience. And the reason why I say that is because one, again, it makes it more seamless for the user to work and engage with my organization, therefore stickiness, right? They will stay and want to work with my organization. And then security is kind of just embedded behind the scenes. And it's done in a way where, again, it's not an irritive or an irritation that the user is saying, getting into this environment is just such a pain, then I'm going to look for a loophole to get around that. And therefore, should I get around the security controls? So again, embedding the security mechanisms to validate, authenticate the actual identity coming in, whether it's an individual or even a thing right now, in doing so in a manner where, again, ultimately that experience is at the forefront of understanding that outcome that the business is ultimately looking for. So that's another area that we're seeing a lot of focus on. And again, it ties back into a key aspect about keeping positiveness with the users, again, internally, but also now the consumers that they're working with, and wanting them to be part of the brand, continue spending obviously with the organization, and so on and so forth.
Hey, Rob, another area that crosses over that we might want to mention is the whole data access governance. You know, the fact that, again, it is an identity aspect, right? You're controlling access to that set of data, and how you can do that in a consistent manner, no matter what the access point is, and ensuring that the entitlements are properly aligned, and that you can govern that process, whether it be for your workforce or for your consumers, or in the government case, the citizens, right? So again, I think that's another thing that we're seeing in the market, the prevalence or the transition to data access governance as being a primary driver for how they're looking to manage risk.
And I think that, Stan, is also a great example, kind of goes back to one of the previous questions about the, do these four elements kind of cross over with one another? And as I said, yes, that's a great example of where they do, right? So think about it, that would be kind of, hey, here's the data side of the equation, here's the identity side of the equation, kind of the functional team supporting those things, and where they're starting to kind of come together for supporting that particular requirement that they have, right? More visibility, governance, just another good way to look at it.
And when I say governance, one aspect of this is, if you guys think about all of the unstructured and structured data in the environment, it is really challenging identifying improper access rights. And so getting that visibility as to, well, why does Rob have access to the source code repo? He's in finance. Well, he inadvertently was granted this. I mean, so again, it's one of those things where part of that's identity and just understanding entitlements, but also is understanding the kind of data you're giving that individual or entity access to. And that level of visibility to be able to make the right decisions is difficult to obtain sometimes.
Good points. I'm going to close out with this. I wanted to pull up a kind of a visual example of looking at one of the elements. And so I picked the data piece of it as an example. And then you can do this for any of the different areas. So again, depending on the particular organization that you either are part of, or hopefully in the future will be a part of, looking and saying, okay, when I break down data for the particular business I'm in, or even if I'm supporting a line of business, what are those challenges I'm seeing on that? These challenges cut across many different types of organizations in general, right? But you can see that these are the challenges to take into consideration. So things like, how do I protect the data is one thing, but the cost associated to protect the data, right? The cost associated data breach. So just examples of challenges are then aligned to, well, what's the actual business value that we're looking at relative to the element? In this case, again, data. Well, data obviously drives, as we talked about, monetization of the data for different types of new business initiatives is another area to look at. But it also has concerns associated, with being able to reduce overall data breach. So you can see, again, the alignment of each of these going across. And then ultimately on over to the right, again, the outcomes, pretty consistent, right? What I talked about earlier. These are kind of the consistent top level outcomes to take into consideration. And those really support everything coming over from the left to the right. My point is that you can kind of take these things, and I'm more visual. So like I like to basically jot down my notes, break it down and say, okay, this is how I'm mapping it out. And then translate that into how I'm going to have the conversation with the different stakeholders to make my point, right? Which is, where do we have the opportunity to make it better for whatever you're trying to accomplish in that associated initiative you're working on to support the business? So just as an example, and a leave behind to take into consideration. So that kind of rounds out the areas I wanted to just walk you guys through. Tanisha, I'll now open it up for any additional questions anyone has. I'll take a look at the chat as well. I don't see any more questions in the chat. Guess we'll just open it up, Tanisha, if there's anyone that wants to come on and make any points or ask any questions of Stan and I.
So I have a question. So it seems like a lot of the conversations that you're having were at the executive level, right? So does this also apply to folks that are at the individual contributor role in their careers, like people who may be earlier? Like, do you think it makes sense for them to, kind of point out these kind of things that tie into the business to help increase their profile within the organization?
I think you're spot on. That's what it is. Increase their profile, increase their awareness, where they're not only coming into it from either a cyber perspective only, a technology perspective only, like they're looking and saying, where can we make a better impact of cyber into supporting what the business is? So I think that's the key there. You, in my opinion, will really stand out coming in early in your career and looking at it as, what are we actually trying to accomplish, right? And I mean, honestly, some of these things out there is, if you're going to work at a public company, take the time to go and read what the actual annual report, the 10K filing is, right? You have access to all of it. It's something that we do, like Stan and I, for example, is we're going to go and engage with one of our clients. We're going to prepare. And we're going to prepare in a manner where we can look at publicly available information that shows what their core initiatives are. And then we can do a translation of where any of those particular initiatives, not all of them, but the specific ones that we may be able to support somehow, some way with cyber-oriented solutions are. And when we're conversing with the organization, we're positioning it in that manner. And so again, to your point, Tanisha, when you're talking to that particular stakeholder in the organization as someone new into the organization and looking to elevate their role, if you're speaking in the business talk and translating what cyber can do to support those key areas, you're going to be paid attention to as someone who really understands beyond kind of solving technology problems to be able to solve business problems or enhance business capabilities. That's something that people are really looking to take advantage of. And again, to me, in a way to be able to fast track your career.
And Tanisha, you're right. It's available in Edgar. I think an example of this, for example, if you see in the 10K as they explain to their stakeholder, or their shareholders, hey, we're accelerating based on the pandemic, our workload transitions over to the cloud. Well, it gives you also a clue that how are we going to secure that? So I mean, it gives you that weather vane, right, as to where the company is going, and you need to be also contemplating the security ramifications for that. That could give you some heads up as to where you need to be, focusing your efforts, and maybe transitioning to that if that's up and coming as far as a major project or initiative.
All right, there's another question.
I just want to call out one thing, Tanisha. Let me just extend that really quick, because there's also a new role or new opportunity, relatively new role opportunity that this plays into very nicely, which is the role of a BISO, Business Information Security Officer. So you're seeing many more organizations now hire for BISOs. And typically what that is larger businesses that have multiple lines of businesses we've been discussing. What they're doing is they're inserting a Business Information Security Officer at each of those different lines of business. So those new opportunities are pretty prevalent out there now and will continue to grow. That does that translation of what is actually cyber in the means of what the business is trying to support. So again, just kind of calling out that there's great opportunity in career pathing as another way to look at what the market's hiring for.
All right, so there was a question from Radisha. How does data access governance work in regards to third-party companies that may be in control of sensitive information, and how can we assess that they are playing their part, and does PCI and compliance look at how they manage resources for that company?
Stan, do you want to address the data access governance portion of it?
Yeah. So I mean, I think that I'll give an example. So when I was at a financial firm, we had a large number of SIs that were asked to take on a number of functions, and we controlled access in this case by requiring that they use our assets and use our data repositories. And to some degree, I had to play policeman, right, and monitor for inappropriate transfer of data, whether through emails or other means, and you basically have to lay down the rules of the road as far as what is expected and how that data is going to be treated and how it's going to be accessed. So that has to be laid down and understood and communicated effectively. And then you need to have a way of monitoring, whether through data access, data leak protection, through other means, or put in controls that provide you like digital rights management type of controls that gives you that visibility to where the data is going if it's unstructured, and being able to then have control over that access, even when it leaves your perimeter. But you need to have that ability to monitor so you can then rein them in if they're misbehaving. And in this case, they were misbehaving, and I had to put the hammer down several times to ensure that they understood that the governance we were putting in place we were serious about. So I think that's one of those the challenges. People will, in this case, there were crazy timelines and they were just trying to do the best they could. We weren't getting the laptops to them fast enough. It was our bad. So they were trying to get their job done. So they were trying to complete things even without our assets. But the rules were you had to use our assets to access our data. So they were violating it for a good purpose because they wanted to get their work done. But at the same time, that was increasing the risk to the business by doing that. And so you had that bit of a tug of war sometimes in place.
All right, so I got another question. It says, can you share any tips that will help become more persuading during the delivery or engagement with clients? Any tips on cadence or any books or sources out there that we can obtain to help with the delivery piece?
Rob, do you have anything on that?
I don't have anything specific on resources and books to point to, unfortunately.
Let me see if I have anything here. I'll look for that and see if there's any other questions.
All right, does anyone else have any questions they'd like to ask our guests? We're wrapping up here in a couple of minutes, so if you have any questions, please feel free to drop in the chat or unmute yourself.
Let's see.
I have a question about third-party risk, and can you share any experiences that you may have with it, or I have interest in going into that area. Can you share if it's a moving part of the business or a good thing to kind of get into right now?
Oh, it is definitely increased in importance. Yeah, if you look at the heightened awareness of supply chain and third parties being an avenue of an attack vector, and how you can get assurances that the third parties aren't introducing risks. As an example, in the past, and I think this is still a practice, you have assessments that are questionnaires that typically the third parties will complete and give you as sort of the evidence that they're doing the right thing. That you're laying out standards and you're laying out expectations and they're filling out questionnaire. You have to do more than that now, right? You have to actually go out and see where their sites are. We found sites that they claim they had that they were just vacant fields. You have to also validate what they're sending you. I mean, so if you have a third party that's creating code for you, for an application, you may have to test it yourself, even though you may have requirements that you are going to inherit risky code. So I think there's a lot more emphasis on third-party validation, and I think that is a good area to pursue. Rob, you want to add anything to that?
I agree, Nathaniel. Yeah, I agree, Nathaniel. It's definitely a good area to focus in on. I'll offer up to anyone, please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Nathaniel, I ask that you do, because what I will do is I will connect to a very solid program that one of the large insurance companies in the Northeast has put into play. And I'll try to connect you also with the individual who's put the program into play and is responsible for it, because she's always looking for, having conversations and kind of sharing, just of what third-party risk management is all about. But the programmatic based approach that they put into place, which she is the person that really has led the way with it, is I think something that just needs more emphasis and focus on. So it definitely is a very good area to get in and put some energy behind.
So there's a question about whether or not you have any resources about how to tie technical with legal information. I think the woman says that she is a lawyer and she's just trying to make sure that she can, I guess, have a tie-in for those, intersections.
Actually, I might. Hang on. Go ahead, Rob.
So beyond like a resource such as a book or something to that effect, I would say as an individual, Stan, I would allude to Sean Tuma, who's
that episode, yeah.
Yeah, so we do a podcast, Stan and I actually, called Reimagining Cyber. And one of the more recent episodes that you would find there is one that we did with Sean Tuma, who's an attorney focused on cyber. I would follow him on LinkedIn, Twitter, and he has a lot of good material as well to be able to share. If you go to cyberres.com and you'll look at the top, you'll see where there's the podcasts.
I just put the link in the chat. I just put the link in the chat, and the Sean Tuma episode was episode 15.
There you go. And he's definitely a wealth of knowledge in this space.
And he has his own blog, so you can visit Shane. What is it? I mean, we mentioned the podcast. Let's see, Spencer and Fain, Spencer Fain LLP. He has a blogcast and other things that he has posted on his site in the privacy and cybersecurity practice area that you can check out.
All right. Well, I want to thank you, gentlemen, for coming out and hanging out with us today. I really appreciate it. It's 1 o'clock, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time. But thank you so much for coming. And I know you guys are doing some other events, I think later on in, I want to say August. So they'll be able to touch base with you guys again at some point. But Rob, thank you for discussing risk. I think this is very important to everyone on the call.
All right, great.
Great. Well, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity. And again, just building up the community out there. We're all here to help one another out. So reach out to us for anything we can help you with.
All right, sounds good.
Thanks,
everyone
Tanisha,
have a good day.
Together. Appreciate it.